Thank you so much for having me here. I hope you can hear me okay through the mask and everything. So I just want to quickly note, I co-direct two different labs. One is called the Computational Culture Lab, which is part with Stanford as well. And we combine machine learning and online experiments to model culture in a computational framework. And I also co-direct a research collective called CompSyn, which stands for Computational Aesthetics. And we can combine machine learning and computational linguistics methods to study aesthetics and multimodal cognitive representations. And what I'll be talking to you today is a research program that I've been developing for a couple of years, which is looking at how the structure of a communication network among people shapes the kinds of categories they create, new category systems. And I'm particularly interested in the conditions under which we might be able to make predictions about the kinds of categories based on what we know about the structure of the network that they are in, but also interested in studying cases where the social networks can lead to highly unpredictable or highly varied category systems across groups as a broader inquiry into what we could consider to be the cultural evolution of category systems. And I'll be talking to you today about the first paper set of studies that was published on that and some of the extensions that we have explored since. So the question that really gets this program off the ground is society faces this inescapable categorization problem. This is particularly clear if we look at innovation. So new companies, products, art forms are emerging on the regular, and a large body of work from sociology, economics, and others has revealed that we need to categorize these new products, these new offerings, in order to situate them in markets, assign them value, and orient ourselves toward them. Now, a particularly interesting finding that has formed the basis for decades of research is what's called the illegitimacy discount. And what this is this consistent finding across a variety of contexts that if a new product or new organization is difficult to categorize, people are much less likely to review it and much less likely to positively adopt and engage with this. And the argument here is that if you are unable to categorize this new product, it's difficult to find relevant comparisons to assess its potential value, difficult in general to make sense of how it might be of use to you. Now, a consistent theme across that body of research is that they assume a category system exists, say among a set of analysts in the market or among the audience, and then it basically asks to what extent does a given new cultural product fit within that existing category system. Now the challenge though is if we look at how people actually categorize these new innovations, pretty consistently we have to develop new category systems to navigate these spaces. We can think of all the new categories that have emerged to make sense of cryptocurrencies, for instance. Been some really interesting work showing that actually there's quite a wide variety of different category systems that emerge, and only over time did we steadily converge on a particular framework. Now, if we look at where do these new category systems come from on the fly to make sense of these innovations, at a broad stroke, there are two theoretical frameworks that people tend to lean on when orienting. And one of them is what you may be familiar with is generally referred to as social constructivism. And here the argument is that we're really to be understanding category formation as a shared collaborative process. We negotiate interpretations and we're developing conventions, ways of talking to understand each other. We're going to coordinate. Now, this interpersonal view of category formation, what it has tended to emphasize is all the ways in which chance attributes of that interaction could be the different perspectives of the people involved. It could be power dynamics. It could be other contextual factors. They emphasize how these features of the social interaction can lead category systems, category formation astray. It can lead one group to arrive at different category systems than another, create unique or what they call path-dependent trajectories in the category formation process. And as a result, those who are interested in social constructivism tend to emphasize data on cross-cultural variation. And they make a number of social, cultural, historical arguments for what gives rise to that cross-cultural variation. Now, many of you may be familiar that this perspective has essentially been ensnared in decades of debate with the view of cognitive universals broadly construed. I'm casting a wide net here, but generalizing the view here is trying to understand, first off, category formation as an individual level process and thinking about algorithms that the mind develops for a variety of constrained reasons that have to do with detecting information in the world in a fixed way based, say, on our sensory faculties or other aspects of neurocognitive development. There are also arguments of innate concepts themselves that we develop for a variety of both computational and neurobiological reasons. And the argument is that these psychological regularities are conserved across people just as a function of the neurobiology of humanity. And the people who emphasize this argument from cognitive universals tend to lean on striking evidence of cross-cultural similarities in the vocabularies that form. Now, just to give you a taste of that, these are some of the examples of these cross-cultural regularities and vocabulary systems that have gained a lot of attention. So there is a broader list of what are called classification universals. These are, vocabulary systems that are highly similar across upwards of 40 different languages that were developed by largely historically and culturally distinct human groups. And this list has gained quite a lot of attention, including by prominent thinkers like Steven Pinker. And this is just a subset of the examples that appear in this list. And you may notice that if we look at the top 4 or 5, there's some sort of intuitive appeal to these. So this is, geometry, flora, fauna, and body parts. The intuitive appeal here is we can imagine these domains having clear physical structure, that if you have a brain and a mind that has particular constraints for, say, what appears salient to you when looking at differences in your experience, you might naturally grab onto boundaries or informational differences that are out there in the world that particularly fit the constitution of our mind. However, the challenge is if we look at other domains where we see cross-cultural regularities in vocabulary systems, these include domains where there isn't clear physical structure that we can imagine the brain sort of quote unquote naturally latching onto. The context like emotions or even social activities like eating, hunting, and so forth. Also domains like gender, kinship, and race. And this is where the debate between cognitive universals and social constructivists get particularly heated because of the amount of emphasis that comes from the social construction point of view, but the context-dependent, cultural-dependent nature of some of these other constructs. And if you think about the kinship and race example, there's one paper by Guilbeault, just to give you a sense of how they make that argument for cognitive universals underlying it. In this case, the argument for race, having certain consistent vocabulary systems across cultures, the argument is that there is a cognitive module for species detection, and that essentially the human mind bootstraps that onto the understanding of race. So that's the argument made by that author and a number of folks about how we could have a cognitive universal story to account for that regulation. Now, across all these different contexts, the reason why they make this argument for cognitive universals ends up in some ways being an argument from parsimony, which is given all the different sources of variation across these cultures, both where they developed, the historical context, innumerable differences, how could they possibly arrive in an independent way on highly similar category systems? What's the common unit that is consistent across these cases? And the argument is that that must be something to do with psychobiology. That's what people are taking with them no matter where they go. So it's in some ways a statistical argument. And what I'm going to be arguing with you today is that actually we don't need this psychobiological account to make sense of these regularities, that this argument of reductionism isn't required to account for these large-scale patterns of similarities, because a lot of the data that underlies this framework here actually comes from observational data, whether it be in written text and other sort of recordings of culture, and that data is very sparse, and we actually don't have direct insight into the social and cognitive processes that end up giving rise to these vocabulary similarities across culture. So what I'll be providing you with today is a set of models and experiments that actually try to get a social network perspective on how we can both get cross-cultural variation, but also cross-cultural similarities, despite widespread cognitive variation and diversity among individuals. So to get started, I want to emphasize what I call the puzzle of category diversity, and this will help situate the problem. So if we think of some really fantastic foundational work that was actually done here at Berkeley by Eleanor Rosch, This is some of the earlier work that started to ground category formation as an individual process. They had these tasks that had a similar structure, and they all somewhat look like this, where you had a set of stimuli, and you would be given a category like square, and separate individuals would be asked, which of these do you most consider to be a square? And what they found was that separate individuals, who all happened to be, at the time, undergraduates at the same university, would make very similar choices in this context. And so then the question is, what does this actually demonstrate about the nature of category formation? And the argument was that the fact that these individuals are separately arriving at very similar choices in this context, in this body of work, was taken to be evidence that categorization is not an arbitrary product of historical accident or whim, but rather the result of these universal psychological principles. So the way in which that body of work was framed was actually in response to the social constructivist view, saying, no, actually at the individual level, there's a lot of regularity. Now, there are two key limitations. Of course, this work was fantastic, and we've learned an enormous amount through these paradigms, but there are two key limitations. One is that pretty consistently in this body of work, people were asked to use a category they were already familiar with, like square. So when you see these kinds of regularities, it's not clear. Is it because there is an innate concept of square that people just naturally figure out how to use? Or have they learned a concept square through a set of social processes, and these regularities actually have to do with common trajectories of socialization? The second limitation is pretty consistently the sets of stimuli that they were asked to select among were pretty limited and constrained. So here you just have like, a small set of different shapes, but of course they replicated this type of analysis for like furniture and articles of clothing. Nevertheless, it was argued that these simplified contexts actually generalize to much more continuous domains with complex objects that vary along many dimensions when you're picking from very diverse and complex sets. And here's, Roche arguing in that paper, most categories partition domains whose stimuli are not discrete, but composed of continuous variation. Now, the trick, though, is if we look at the kinds of experiments that actually study novel stimuli exhibiting this continuous variation, we actually don't see very clear patterns of individual regularity. So I'll give you one example by Roger Shepard. It's an excellent cognitive scientist. Basically had this study where they had people categorize these amorphous blobs that they hadn't seen before. And individuals could group together these blobs in any way that they saw fit. And you'd see the same amorphous blob categorized as a tomahawk, a bird, a woman wearing a hat, a lion. And this is just a small taste of all the different ways in which people came up with labels and grouped together these shapes. Now, the challenge is if we look at these kinds of contexts where we're actually faced with these novel, underdetermined, underspecified domains, if we see evidence of considerable individual variation in association and categorization, it raises this puzzle, which is in domains where we are actually seeing the novel formation of categories, how do we actually get from this individual level variation to the cross-cultural regularities that we see? And this is, of course, important if we think in a retrospective way, because all these category systems that we take for granted, that we learn in our culture, had to be developed at some point. So all category systems involved at some point the interaction and labeling of a novel domain. But then also moving forward, when we see new domains emerging in terms of cultural products, we also see this puzzle arise of how do people actually form categories as well. Now, if you look at this evidence of individual variation, that ends up getting us right back into the camp of the social constructivists. So here, the traditional view is, well, if you have a lot of different ways of thinking about categories, let's say the vertical axis here, we'll call that cross-group similarity. And what I mean by that is the similarity of the category systems across separate social groups. So the argument, just to simplify it, is that basically as you have more diversity in a human population, different ways of categorizing, you're actually going to get different groups arriving at different category systems. Now, the reason why on the horizontal axis here I have size of social group is because this is typically how this has been operationalized in the social science literature on this. And so one of the arguments, just to give you a taste of this, is basically that if there are more people in a group, there's greater degrees of freedom, there are more opportunities for people to diverge and how they categorize this space. And then the argument is that if there's more diversity in the group, then there's more opportunities for populations to diverge from each other. And we can think of this as if there's a ton of different options in how people are going to categorize a given space. One population might adopt category A early on, and this will have consequences on the next category that they develop. Whereas if a different population happens to adopt a different category early on, it can set them on a different trajectory in the kinds of category systems that they form. And this is what I was referring to is generally called path dependence. And there have been a variety of studies, this being one example in the anthropological literature, that makes this argument as well. And a part of the story here also has to do, like one part of it has to do with linguistic innovation. The argument is that larger populations exhibit faster rates of new coinages of words, which are also expected to contribute to increasing variation across populations. Now, the sort of final takeaway of this body of work, which has supported a general paradigm in thinking about social dynamics, is that category systems are, the formation of category systems is expected to be at some level fundamentally unpredictable. It's like the tip of the iceberg. We can think of how much complexity goes into everything from physics to your biology, to your brain, to your mind. And then you get a bunch of minds interacting, and just the degrees of freedom are enormous. And so in terms of our ability to understand these dynamics in a formal predictive way, it's assumed to elude that. Now, there was a part of that that didn't really sit well with me for two reasons. One is that, of course, it's incredibly important. Category formation is such a foundational part of social life and human decision-making that it sure would be really nice if we could understand whether there's any predictability in how that process unfolds. The second thing is there's actually a growing amount of body of work coming from biological sciences and also physics, which actually illustrates that there are a variety of contexts where randomness in systems can actually promote regularities. So what might seem at some levels of analysis to be intractable or unpredictable, that this can actually induce regularities at a collective level in terms of emergent phenomenon. And so this was the general framework that I started digging into, and it actually led me to arrive at the opposite intuition, which is actually, as you would increase diversity in a social system of the kinds of categories that people form, you would actually find that separate groups arrive at increasingly similar category systems. Now, to walk you through, here are three of the main reasons. First off, some of it was building on work from my advisor in my dissertation and my collaborator, Andrea Baron-Kelly. And basically, they set up what was called the name game. So this was basically all people had to do. They were in some online experiment, and they just had to, they were shown a face they had never seen before, and they just had to come up with a name for the face. So like you see a face, and I say Bob, you say Joe, you say Sam, and at some point, we just all have to agree it's Bob, it's Sam, or it's Joe, and we get rewarded for the extent to which we agree. And what they observed in these systems is they went through two distinct phases. So early on, it's a total cacophony, bunch of different names bouncing around, seems chaotic, seems unpredictable. But this pressure to match each other, to coordinate, to successfully communicate, ends up compressing the space, actually in a nonlinear fashion, so that you can get the rapid convergence to a single name that people end up using. Now, an additional point, and so this paper on PNAS, which is on what they titled the spontaneous emergence of conventions, one of the arguments there was that certain network topologies are more likely, topology here is the pattern among the connections of people in a network. Certain topologies were more likely to promote the spontaneous emergence of shared conventions. And in particular, they found that fully connected networks, so these are networks where a person has connections to everyone else in the network. So you're basically maximizing the diversity of folks that they're interacting with. That is actually the best conditions to support the emergence of these conventions. Now, this hinted towards group size, though they weren't making it explicit and weren't thinking about it in that way, but it does suggest that actually increasing the number of people that you're interacting with can actually promote the emergence of these shared conventions. Another is that there's actually a body of work at the intersection of linguistics and cognitive science, which has started to look at the way in which populations, networks can actually amplify weak cognitive biases. So to give you an example, this study by Christiansen and Chatter focused on grammars, and they basically found that, of course, at an individual level, there are preferences for which grammars are more learnable than others, but they're weak. The individual children can actually learn a variety of different grammars, but they show some preference towards some than others. And they identify this correlation that if you look at the languages that are used by the largest populations, languages with larger populations are more likely to have grammars that are those that are more learnable and preferred at the individual level. So they make this broader argument, using that as an example of that maybe one of the things that networks are doing are actually amplifying weak cognitive biases in a selection process, such that that's the linguistic and cognitive conventions and norms that populations end up developing. Now, they weren't thinking about category systems, they're thinking about grammar. And similarly, the name game also isn't a category system because it's just an arbitrary label. They could be naming the space anything. One of the things that's key to categorization is a grouping process. You're actually looking at a set of things and you're going to put them all into the same label based on the attribution of some common trait or property that they all share that gains membership into the set. But looking at these connections, I thought, what if this actually could provide a theory for category formation? All you would need is that what if there is a ton of diversity among people, but there are certain weak preferences, there are certain biases where some categories are even slightly more likely to be formed than others. Well, combining it with these two frameworks, you would arrive at the intuition that actually in larger populations, you could get the amplification of these weak cognitive biases for category formation. Now, very quickly, because to be keep up with time, it actually does track as well with evolutionary models, in particular the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Very briefly, I encourage you to look up the model if you're not familiar. It's a really interesting model. But basically, it looks at speciation and diversification, the evolution of the phenotype of the species. And imagine a scenario where you have a continent and you have a species that's pretty consistent with continuous. So we think about, like, say, some ape population. Now imagine there's an earthquake and now an island pops off. So you can ask, well, how is the evolution of whatever apes landed on that island? Is that going to be the same as the apes who by chance stayed on the continent? Or under what conditions are they actually going to go on a different trajectory? And the finding is that if the population that lands on the island is small, the extent to which it's small, you'll actually get divergence, because just whatever chance combination of alleles, genetic material that was among that subset of the population, that's now going to drive the transmission of alleles going forward. But the larger that sample is, the more and more it statistically resembles the population that stayed on the continent, and they will increasingly stabilize in terms of the transmission of which alleles. And that involves arguments around which alleles are more fit, and that's beyond the scope. But there's also a way in which that tracks with the intuitions being developed here. So in smaller populations, you can get chance combinations of ideas, chance combinations of categories. The argument is it can lead the category formation down unique trajectories, whereas in larger populations, with all these other assumptions, you would arrive at the conclusion that the evolutionary dynamics could stabilize. So this is what I theoretically modeled. And then what I'll be focusing on with you today is the online experiment that I designed in order to test this theory. So first, I'm going to talk about the experiment and then the result. We'll talk about some possible objections, ways of understanding that supporting the theoretical take that I developed for this result. And then I'll talk about a replication with Mandarin speakers based in China, because all the results I'm going to focus on in the first study are with English-speaking subjects in the US. And then we'll talk about some conclusions. So this is a link to the paper here. It's open access. So I encourage you, if you want to read more, this is where you can find all the details. So in thinking about testing this theory, we had to develop some methodological innovations. So first off, we needed to be able to study category formation among people in large social networks. And that was a non-trivial challenge, because if you look at a lot of the research in experimental psychology, it involved on category formation at the individual level, a lot of it involved folks actually like pushing around tiles on a table. And there's a lot that we learned from that body of work, a really interesting set of paradigms, but it's hard to scale to large groups, especially when they're coming into a single room. Like if you wanted to study category formation among, say, groups of 50 or more people, there are some logistical challenges in scaling up that paradigm. The second thing is we want to make sure that people are categorizing novel and also continuous stimuli. So when I was mentioning the Roche experiments, right, we don't want them to just have to categorize a couple of stimuli, and particularly ones they're familiar with. We want to get something closer to the Shepherd framework of amorphous blobs or something genuinely novel, and then have them represented in a continuous space so we can really see to what extent people actually, how they group together these novel stimuli and then compare that across different social groups. And then we need a social environment where people can interact to form categories in large groups for this novel continuous stimuli. So we built an online platform, a website that allowed us to scale this up and actually check all those boxes. So I'll talk to you about the design of that experiment now. So these were the experimental conditions that participants, they were MTurkers that we recruited, and they came to the same platform, but they were randomized to participate in groups of different sizes along this continuum. So the smallest group was a dyad, so they're interacting with the same person back and forth for the experiment. And the largest group is 50. We had 15 separate groups of 50 people. And I just want to emphasize there's no overlap between anyone in these groups. Every population consisted of a unique person. Each person only took the experiment once. Just a brief note, we also ran an individual version of the experiment. All the results check out with what we're having here, but I'll be focusing on the interaction context. So the task took over an hour. It was a lot of interactions because you have to give enough time for a category system to arise. That's also hard because people's attention is limited and you have to somehow sufficiently incentivize MTurkers to stay in a task. So I'm happy to talk more about all the logistics and like UX design stuff that had to happen in order to figure that out. But in the end, certainly paying them generously really helped. But there was also some other logistics. This is the stimuli that they categorized. Basically, we created a continuous space by starting with like a Rorschach blot. And then through rotation, we can gradually transition the shape through a series of intermediate shapes. And one of the key things to emphasize here, I'm just showing you slices, but we can get a step-by-step transition from one to the other. And what's cool about this is we ourselves didn't have any a priori designs or expectations for what this intermediating space would look like. We started with the Rorschach blot, and all of these emergent forms in between were genuinely novel even to us. So it raised the question of how would groups, separate groups of people, actually group together this stimuli? Now, this is how the interaction logic unfolded that created this grouping process. So the game proceeded in a round by round basis, where on every round, someone is playing with only one other person. And in each round, someone's a speaker and the other person is a hearer. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But first, an important thing just to understand is in the case of the dyad, you're interacting back and forth with the same person throughout the experiment. The way in which you get larger networks is, say, on the first round, you and I might be playing. The next round, I might be paired with you or someone else. And so what happens is the categories that we actually develop on a given round with us can now travel through me if I learn that and actually use that with the next person that I'm interacting with in the experiment. And people were able to connect with anyone else in the network. So these are what we call fully connected networks. And that's the case across all populations. So this is how we were able to create a network structure. Now, whoever was speaker and hearer was randomized on every round. So you might be speaker one round, you could be hearer other rounds. It was just fully random. Now, if you were speaker, you were shown 3 images from the continuum. And the system would say, ask your partner to click on this shape by sending them a label. So you could type in any label you want. Let's just say you put in baby. I don't know what kind of baby you have in mind, but let's just say baby. And if you're the hearer, you see the same set of 3 shapes, but the order has been randomized. So you can't just say left, you can't just say right. You actually are going to get the label baby, and you have to make an inference about which of these shapes does the speaker actually intend to refer to. If you click on the correct one, you get a monetary reward, you get told you matched. and you go back into the game. If you click the wrong one, you get told what was the shape that the speaker originally intended to refer to, and you get a mild monetary punishment, which is just the standard way in the network's literature that we operationalize a social learning process. You incentivize learning from each other and disincentivize that. This is just a way to create the incentive structure, because people were paid based on their performance, which is one of the ways that you keep them in the game. So there are two features of this that I want to emphasize. So actually, each round, they saw unique shapes. So they saw shapes that they hadn't seen before previously in the game. Now, this is important because this is actually what creates a categorization process. Because if I'm using baby on the first round, and then if I use it on the second round, I'm necessarily using it on a different set of shapes. So I'm actually grouping them together based on some perceived similarity. And no one in any condition actually was told anything about the size of the group that they were in. So they couldn't, and we actually can show afterwards, we asked them, like, how many people do you think you're interacting with? And people were like surprisingly bad at this. And this actually allowed the network structure to be this control variable under the hood, the thing that we were experimentally manipulating to actually induce differences in the kinds of category systems that they form. So I'm going to go into the results now. And the way I'm going to show you the results is I'm just going to show you the category systems that they formed. And I personally find this to be a ton of fun. We could spend a lot more time beyond the scope of this talk just looking at qualitatively the kinds of categories and associations they built. But we're going to be focusing on comparing them across groups. So here's the category system for a single dyad. I'm just going to show it to you so we can start to learn the visual grammar of these plots. So the horizontal axis is the continuum. I've just shown you little markers of the shapes corresponding to roughly that area, but numerically it's each step along that continuum, which image is being categorized. And the distributions show where they have used categories most successfully to coordinate and the categories that they converged on. And the color is actually going to indicate which label actually was used and corresponds to that area. So when you see here on your right, they're using the label hockey. You can see these shapes where it sort of looks like sticks and a puck. And sit, you can see on the other side, it sort of looks like a guy sitting. So these are sort of the types of associations that they are forming. If you see negative space, this is actually really interesting because this actually means that they did not successfully come to agree on a category for that area. And it's important that actually we showed shapes from across the continuum in a random uniform manner. So in all kinds of validation tests, we confirm that indeed every single group saw images throughout the continuum. So they were given ample opportunities to actually form labels. They just couldn't actually come to agree. So that's another part of the ontology or the world created by these groups, is what actually could be categorized by them and what sort of remained ambiguous and something they couldn't agree on. So this is the category system for a single dyad. But now we're going to put it side by side with the category systems formed by other dyads, and we can look at the differences and the similarities. So if we start by looking at this dyad, we see variation, not only in which labels were used, but like where they use them. And interestingly, so in some cases, it almost seems like the opposite. So the first dyad is saying sit, the other dyad is saying fly. So you can actually see sort of like, what is counting as a negative space? Is it actually on the ground or is it suspended in the air? You can see all kinds of variation in this way. There's also differences in the number of categories that they ended up developing, and also the kind. So in this case, they tend to skew towards like a nominal, like a noun-based description, but some of them use tall as a sort of way of comparatively solving the task. But to give you a sense, I'm just going to show you now. I've shown you 4 different dyads here. I'm going to show you 10 side by side. And what you see is a ton of variation. So there are differences not only in which labels they use for the same regions, but also where they are actually forming categories. And actually there are 40, in this subset of 10, there's actually 40 unique labels. So roughly 4 unique labels per dyad. And we had something like 80 dyads. So this is just a sample of 10. If I show any more, it starts to look like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, and that's a bit visually overwhelming. But now what I'm going to do is, if we look like back to the theories, right? we see there's a ton of variation here, and that tends to land us in the social constructivist camps. Like there's so much variation, so many different ways that these groups could categorize, see, and experience the stimuli. We would expect if you get a bunch of these folks connected to each other, you'd get even more variation. The degrees of freedom would be much larger. What we're going to do now is look at the category systems that emerged in the networks. And so each row is going to be the category system that formed by a separate network of 50 people. And what we see is a striking amount of uniformity. In fact, every single network of 50 has converged on the use of the label crab for a highly similar region of the space. About 80% of them have converged on the label frog. Now, you see that there's a light blue region and a gray region, and they're overlapping. I show that here because it's interesting, because the light blue is bunny and the gray is rabbit. So there's synonyms, they're generally the same concept. But it's kind of cool because we can look within each population and see essentially rabbit and bunny battling it out. And I'm doing some current work about what actually leads one to take off and the other. And there's lots of interesting questions there. We can also see where they formed categories is highly similar. And I have some additional work looking at the perceptual biases that it can actually lead, because again, they saw images equally from all areas of the continuum. So this is in some ways a cognitive and cultural fact that they all happen to develop labels in that region. And it's irresistible to think that, oh, like, why are they all kind of animal related or related to the natural world? That's an interesting thought on its own in terms of the development of sort of semantic strategy. I have additional work. But for now, the focus is just on the extent to which the vocabularies across these populations are similar. So to distill this in the high level point here, if we have our horizontal axis as the number of categories encountered by a player. So this is a way of thinking about how diverse, cognitively diverse was their social experience? How many different options did they encounter? And then the y-axis here is the cross-group similarity in the vocabulary systems. And this is just measured by the Jacquard index for those interested. The traditional prediction, right, is that as you increase diversity, the amount of different categories people are encountering, that should relate to variation, path dependence across these different populations. What I'm going to show you is the data from each group in different size, and a data point is going to be that group's average vocabulary similarity to all different groups of the same size. And so here we start off with the dyads. And what we can see is that by gradually increasing the size of the group, we actually systematically increase the similarity of the vocabularies formed by groups of that same size. And this is just quickly to show that I developed an agent-based model which built in some of these assumptions, and we can actually fit the same curve to the data. The model actually is highly predictive of the empirical results. And I'll talk a little bit about how bias was implemented here, but basically the agents are engaging in essentially the same coordination task. It's called the categories model, developed by Andrea Barankelli. And the way bias is introduced is how they are sampling categories from this universe of possible categories. And I basically assume a Zipfian distribution, which is like a long tail distribution. Some categories are more likely to be drawn from than others, but most of them are pretty unique, or roughly equivalent in terms of their ability to be sampled. And this was motivated by the fact that if you look at the baseline frequency at which folks actually introduced categories in the experiment, it actually really nicely follows a Zipfian distribution. And so over the whole population, over 6,000 labels were attempted. So there's a lot of different options. But if you look at in the upper left quadrant here, these are the more popular labels like crab and bunny. And just to give you a flavor for that, these were introduced by, say, like somewhere between 20 and 30% of people. So that means these are folks who just independently originated it. They haven't seen it in the task yet. And then there's a bunch of them that are really unique, like Sumo and others, where like only one person ever thought of it in the whole task and tried to communicate it. Now, this is important. It actually plays into the mechanism we use to make sense of this cultural evolution dynamic. And one of the intuitions I rely on here actually comes from the literature on what's called critical mass dynamics and networks. Very simply, basically, this is this argument that if you think about how do you get a norm to spread to the whole population, the literature actually shows that you only need a certain fraction, a certain subset. Once that subset is sufficiently large, you can actually trigger what's called a cascade. So the spreading of that norm to the rest of the population. And in this study, they actually study the name game and show it varies based on certain factors, but the sort of general rule is that once you reach around 25% of the population of people who are using a particular name in this game, then it starts to spread rapidly like wildfire to the rest of the population. So the intuition became, in this categories game, under what conditions do certain categories reach critical mass? Can we measure that? And is it influenced by the size of the group? And this is where, actually, as a result of a strange dream, I had this intuition. This comes from probability theory. It's called the birthday paradox. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a really cool idea. It basically says, what is the probability that you and some other person have the same birthday? So if you just randomly pluck someone from the population, it's actually really low, right? Like 1 over all the possible days interacting with 1 over all the possible days, very low probability. But if we ask, what is the probability that 2 people in this room have the same birthday? It actually is strikingly high. Once you change the size of the reference group, it has this nonlinear effect where actually by the time you reach a population size of 50, you start to get close to being mathematically guaranteed that at least 2 people in that population will have the same birthday. So the intuition here is, instead of birthdays, let's ask the question, what is the probability that 2 people introduce the same category? Okay. So if it's just one category, right, that's going to increase the population size. Now, if you just, extend it a little bit, so one of the things we have to ask is, we're not just interested if 2 people do it. We want to ask, does a certain fraction of folks independently introduce this category? And what is the probability that that occurs? So I extended it with what's called the hypergeometric distribution. Essentially, it's just a way of bootstrapping the logic of the birthday paradox. Essentially, you find the same thing. So if we ask, what is the probability that a given category reaches critical mass? You get this effect of population size. So just to give you a sense, every label we can assume to have a certain baseline probability. How unique is it, right? If it's super unique, which means it's really rare that anyone introduces this category at all, then it's much more unlikely that any 2 people introduce it, right? But one of the strange or interesting properties, right, is we're interested in critical mass, whether a sufficient fraction introduces it. Well, in a dyad, there's this quirky thing, which is that because it's only 2 people, every category is introduced by exactly half the population, right? So every category reaches critical mass, no matter how rare it is, right? But then as you get into larger and larger populations, what is the likelihood that one of these rare categories reaches critical mass? It becomes increasingly hard. But if you have a common category, one of those categories in the Zipfian distribution that is more likely, the ability for that category to reach critical mass actually increases with population size. And so what you get is this nice split in larger populations where the rare labels don't stand a chance in reaching critical mass, and they're up against these categories that have 10, 15, 20 people separately introducing them, and they basically lose out in the competitive selection dynamic in the group. So we can actually map the experimental data onto that continuum, and we indeed see this split. And I think this figure is helpful for understanding that. So this is just looking at the correlation between the initial frequency of a category. So what is the size of the critical mass, the fraction of folks that introduced it, and the fraction of folks that end up adopting this label. So in the dyad, there can be no correlation because every single category is introduced by exactly half. One way to think about this correlation, it's basically how much influence does the critical mass have? What you see as you increase population size, the final category systems that they adopt are increasingly determined by those categories that initially achieved critical mass. So this is really a social dynamic story that you need the networks of particular size to actually amplify the cognitive bias. And that's the broader story here. Now, just to consider one possible objection, an intuition that some of you may be having, which is, what if some categories are just better? So that like if someone tries to use them, it'll be clearer, it's easier to communicate it, it corresponds better to the stimuli. So people are just going to adopt it much more quickly. And that's a great intuition, because that would actually explain this result, because then you would say, well, all that's really happening in the large networks is you're just more likely to get these better categories. Just statistically, you're sampling more, you're going to catch these better categories. And once they're in there, they're going to spread because they're just better. Now, but notice that that intuition also has the following implication, which you would assume that in a smaller population, when those categories were attempted, they would succeed. They wouldn't be beaten out by these other, more inferior categories. So one way in which we tested this is we looked at the areas of the continuum where we saw were associated with the strongest cognitive bias, and this was in the use of CRAB, which we know every single network used the label CRAB, and we identified the region of the continuum that they all used CRAB for, so the crabbiest region of the continuum. Then we looked at the dyads, and we looked not only at the dyads in general, but in those dyads where someone tried to use CRAB for the crabbiest region, what category did they end up adopting? We see hot dog, Hulk, baby, car, smile, flat, sumo, boat. So actually quite a lot of variation, even despite being exposed to what we might consider to be the better categories. Now, you can show in the data that some of these categories are more likely to be adopted at baseline, but the argument here is that features of the categories alone are not sufficient for predicting which categories end up getting adopted, because then they should be driving the outcome in these cases. The argument is that you actually need the social selection processes as well to promote these categories. Now, we also developed a counterfactual experimental test of this, because the most satisfying way to show that would be, well, what if I could take one of these rare categories and then rig the system? So give it a critical mass and then see if you could get a population to adopt it. So this is what we did, right? Because the argument from a social dynamic point of view is, yeah, once you have that critical mass, you can get it to spread. So we took the label sumo and called these the sumo trials. We took a network of 24, and we had 37% of the network were Confederates. And the reason why it was 37 is because in the model, technically, if you expect resistance, you need the critical mass to be larger, and we expected resistance because we expect people to want to use CRAB essentially in the network. So we have a larger critical mass, and they're just tasked with using sumo when they're seeing images from the crabbiest region. So here, this is the fraction of subjects adopting each label. These are the rounds. Indeed, you see CRAB shows up in the population. Sumo is also, and this is, to be clear, the data only among the subjects, the experimental subjects. So these are just the results of the influence of the Confederates. And you see that by the end of the task, actually more folks have adopted the label sumo at some point than CRAB. But importantly, if we look at the rate of usage, so the cumulative number of successful uses between subjects, initially CRAB and sumo are neck and neck, and then eventually they split off and they start increasingly using sumo amongst themselves, basically after it was seeded by the Confederates. And then we proceeded to replicate this 6 times with different network populations. Now, something that's interesting as well, after the task, this is more qualitative data, but it's kind of irresistible. We just showed folks that image and said, describe this to us in your own words. And then we could compare the networks where they didn't have Confederates to the networks where they had Confederates. And what you saw is that in the networks with Confederates, kind of eerily, the subjects actually start describing the shape as looking like a sumo wrestler. Now, if they're just saying sumo, it's like, okay, you saw sumo in the task, you're calling it sumo, whatever. But you see people sort of riffing on that. So they're not even saying sumo, they're like, it looks like a man reaching his arms into the air. So they've sort of internalized some abstraction, and they're actually building on that in an interpretive fashion in a way that like people who described it as a crab never talked about it. Oh, it looks like a crab. That also looks like a man reaching his arms in the air. No, they would describe it as looking like a crab. And this is us quantifying that. So this is the percent of subjects that adopted a given framing. And what you see is in the case of crab, of course, if there were no Confederates, they all pretty much described it as a crab. In the case of the Confederates, you see a significant reduction in that. And then if you look at the folks who at the end of the task end up describing it as looking like a sumo, no one in the non-Confederate task does that, and a considerable fraction of folks end up actually describing it as looking like a sumo. Now, something to note here is this is actually in some ways only a limited influence in terms of someone's self-reported what it actually looks like to them. So even though they use sumo in the task, there's a bunch of folks who, when they got to the task, the end, they're like, yeah, it actually still looks like a crab to me. And it turns out that there's actually interesting individual variation in the extent to which people will internalize the social influence and adopt an alternative framing versus those who basically falsely signal that for a period of time, yeah, it looks like sumo, but it's just to get through this task. At the end, I still think it's a crab. I'm doing some additional work to follow up on like the psychological predictors of that and the social implications of that difference. With the remaining time, I want to quickly cover is one question is like, oh, you found these results, but like, what if it has something to do uniquely with the distribution of categories in English in this US population? So what we did is we actually tested our theory in a different context. So we recruited folks from China who were native Mandarin speakers, had the whole task translated into Mandarin by my colleague. And this is actually at the peak of COVID, where they were all going online in classes, and we actually had some colleagues in Chinese universities who very graciously were willing to have their students take our experiments. We were able to actually replicate the experiment in that sense. And so here's the dyads. We see the dyads in the Mandarin population, again, exhibit considerable variation, both in terms of which labels they're using and where they are forming these categories. But in my view, remarkably, if we look at the networks, separate populations of Mandarin speakers, we see convergence dynamics across the separate populations of Mandarin speakers. And most of these are networks of 24. That was just logistically working with the available sample. The top line is a network of 50. Now, what I think is the most smoking gun result here is every single separate population of Mandarin speakers adopted the label crab, the Mandarin translation of crab for roughly the same region of the continuum. So in some ways, we're getting cross-cultural convergence dynamics out of these communication processes. But fascinatingly, there are categories that most of the networks adopted that don't have an analog in the English-speaking data. So we see weightlifting or meditation. These were not labels that they either were very rare in the English-speaking population and didn't stand a chance in the networks, or they didn't even show up at all at the individual level. So we're really getting a nuanced story here. The networks are basically bootstrapping the distribution of salience of cognitive bias at the individual level. And that can lead cultures either to the same spot, so that they actually have compatible understandings. They can actually understand each other if they were to translate. They can also lead them towards pretty distinct associations, pretty distinct interpretations of the space. So you can also get cross-cultural divergence dynamics. And importantly, it allows us to situate this within a set of communication and network-based mechanisms, even amid all this cognitive diversity. So in conclusion, first, from a cognitive perspective, we basically find that individual category formation for these novel continuous stimuli is diverse. It's hard to predict at the individual level. There's a ton of variation. And this individual level bottom-up psychobiological account doesn't really provide a satisfying complete story of how you would get cross-group category similarity in this experimental context. Sociologically, we actually see that category formation in social networks follows predictable dynamics. And actually, in contrast with the emphasis on path dependence that has come from a lot of the social constructivist literature, we actually see that increasing diversity in categories by increasing group size actually increases the stability of the category systems that emerge across these groups. And one of the thoughts I just want to leave you with is the account from Cognitive Universals really says, oh, what people are bringing with them no matter where they go is something psychobiological, right? What I want to argue to is actually something else that people bring with them no matter where they go are social networks. They're the basis of society, the basis of organizations. We can actually have an alternative complementary, but also an alternative account of how we can get these cross-cultural regularities and also cross-cultural variation. Particular coordination dynamics, I argue, can actually generate consistent trajectories in category formation and lead to consistent collective level outcomes despite rich cognitive variation at the individual level. And I think, does that take me to time? I have some additional slides, but all right, let's take some questions. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. I don't see them either, so I think. Thank you.
When you talk about category formation in this line of thinking, what you're seeing, unless I misunderstood something, you're talking about the ability of people to converge on a pre-existing label, right? For example, so I'm wondering if you have predictions or if you thought about introducing a novel lexicon and see in what you think might happen there, because in that case, it's closer to the conditionalization mechanism that has to be in place for language to work out.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a really great point. The first thing I'll say is that it's actually quite common in lexicalization, the coining of new words, for them to actually leverage existing associations. And the argument from the cognitive science literature there is that analogy-based thinking actually underlies much of the comparisons that we make. So you can think about like the emergence of snowboard being a concatenation of snow and board. But even when you see like new companies come up that have arbitrary names, it's like, oh, well, they're the Uber of X, you know? So even how we define these novel terms comes through that. I think one of the reasons why we ended up taking this approach is first, like that view of categorization actually involving an analogy process. But it raises this interesting question, which is if you had a novel lexicon, it actually is very cognitively